Welcome back, everyone. We're now with Patrice Gordon, an inclusive leadership expert, and she's going to guide us through the concept of reverse mentorship. Patrice, welcome to the FT.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
And to this Headspring event. And I wanted to start off by asking you just very simply, what is reverse mentoring?
Okay. Well, reverse mentoring is where we have senior leaders who are mentored by people who are underrepresented around that senior leadership team table. So the way that I look at it, could be from a gender and ethnicity and age perspective, which is our big thing at the moment with 5 generations in the workforce, sexuality, disability, any of those protected characteristics which may not kind of rise to the top in the same way, is what I'm really encouraging leaders to lead into.
And I just wanted to say to everyone watching, if you have a question, just pop it on and we'll get it on the iPads here. I want this to be as interactive as possible. It's very informal.
Yep.
Patrice is an expert in informality.
Yep.
So what first got you into reverse mentoring? Because it's a relatively new concept, isn't it?
It is. It started by Jack Welch, General Electric in the 1990s, again, full circle, because it was from a technological point of view. He had senior leaders in the organisation who weren't necessarily au fait with the technological changes that are coming ahead. And as per the previous session that we just heard, that change is coming around again from a technology perspective. But ultimately, I was involved in reverse mentoring from a gender and an ethnicity perspective at Virgin Atlantic. I had been involved in a number of other activities outside my day job, shall we say, to help drive inclusivity within the business, and they were very receptive of it. So when it got to the point where they were thinking of launching this reverse mentoring program, our CEO at the time, Craig Krieger, was incredibly brave and said, actually, I don't have any Black women in my inner circle or my work circle, and I really would love to understand the different perspectives so I can see how we can build this to be a more inclusive environment to work in. And so I was the natural choice just because I had been involved in a few activities previously, and that was my first experience of it.
And how did that go for you? Can you explain a little bit about how it works?
Yes, of course. So I had a lead from the business HR department, which was Estelle Hollingsworth. She was our chief HR. She is now the chief HR officer. And ultimately, there was a lot of teeing up because I'm putting myself in a really vulnerable position. Craig was also putting himself in a really vulnerable position. We needed to be really clear as to what the objectives of the program were, and that was set up really nicely. So it was an exploration. It was a safe space to learn and ask questions and to really develop a relationship with someone that you might not normally have in the workplace. And so we were really clear in terms of this is the outcome that we're expecting. And the ultimate aim was to build more belonging within the workplace, to help shine a light on some differences, to make sure the leadership team were aware of what needs to be changed and adjusted to make it a more inclusive environment to work in. So we met once a month. The first meeting was off-site, which was really nice. This was pre-COVID. So it was nice to meet outside of the office without those distractions. And there was really just a getting to know you session to really check the chemistry, make sure that we were both happy with continuing the relationship going forwards. And then it turned into some deep, meaningful questions and insights around my lived experience. Born in Jamaica, came to the UK when I was 3, my formative years and the decisions that I made for my career and for my schooling, and subsequently that led me to the position I was in. And he was also really open about asking me around challenges that I might have had, and outside of the workplace and also inside the workplace, so that he could influence and maybe try to influence and make it a better place to work.
And did you find right from the start that you could be open?
In my roles have always, so senior roles within finance and within commercial, I am really good at kind of getting my point across in a really objective way, which is why I think I was selected. And so, of course, for me, it was challenging because this is personal, not business. And it was the first time I was seen. I felt seen, actually. And I think that was alluding to some of the sessions that we listened to earlier. The first time I was seen as an individual, as opposed to just the work that I did. So that part was slightly nerve-wracking, I must admit. But to be honest, going into that relationship, I knew that it was to drive impacts for the organisation. So I was really confident in what I was saying and what I was sharing, because you can't get being yourself wrong.
No, it's true. And to take it, more of a macro view, what would you say are the benefits for organisations, for people watching?
There are a few things that are ongoing at the moment. And I think maybe this is a good time for us to switch to the poll, because actually if we switch to the poll now, I'd like to ask the audience some questions around what they think the biggest challenges are across kind of the economy and the business world at the moment. So if we could bring up the poll, I'd like to ask, I'm going to explain it, but I'd like to ask the audience to participate in a Menti poll that we've got coming up at the moment. I think it's coming up.
There it is.
Perfect. Okay, so there's lots of research that I do, and when I was entering into this the first time, it was very much from a personal perspective, and then it led me to do lots of research, which we'll come on to next. But ultimately, there are 5 mega trends that are ongoing in the organisation There are 5 major transformations and mega trends that are going on in economy and in society at the moment. The first one that we've got is really looking at, I think the top one up there is the demographic changes and shifts. And ultimately, there are up to 5 generations in the workforce today. So this is a major challenge for leaders, organizations, governments who are looking to influence and put in place policies which are going to be relevant to lots of different people. This is putting a strain on our environment, in the UK, on our NHS system. So the infrastructure really has to adjust and adapt to these changes in demographics. We also have this technological advancement, which we've obviously talked about quite a bit today. So generative AI, technology in general, how much do we think that is impacting the way that we work now and how that's going to work in the future? The fact that we've also got a massive impact on climate change and what that is going to look like for future generations, but we're actually seeing it really live now, and we all have to take action to address that. We have this massive impact of urbanization too. So lots of hotspots across the globe that are moving into these massive economic powerhouses. And these economic powerhouses are almost the GDP of some small countries in some instances. So we've got these 5 megatrends that are ongoing at the moment. And I think there's always bids in terms of which one's the hottest one right now. But for our audience at home and joining online, it's really interesting for us to see which ones you think are the top ones. So if we could flip back over to the poll to see what the big ones are. So we're saying actually resource scarcity, so the climate change one is the biggest one, demographic changes, and then technology, with shifts in the kind of global economic power that really touches on the fact that through technology, globally, different countries are able to express different parts of economic power. And that might have been really different in the past, but with technology, with the demographic changes, with climate change, actually we've got some smaller countries that are able to exert much more power than they could have done previously. So I think bearing in mind as we go forward with these conversations, those 5 big megatrends, when you look at the fact the organisation and the economic world is shifting so dramatically, I'm not saying that reverse mentoring is the be all and end all of that, of course, but what I am saying is ultimately that demographic shift, the technology piece and the climate change piece, alongside the urbanization particularly, are some things that we can use reverse mentoring to address. So we can look at it from an age perspective, for example, in the same way as Jack Welch brought it in for General Electric. Right now, we're looking at the likes of generative AI, but also social media and the way that impacts the way that we do business, the way that we can look at trends and understand, what's coming down the pipeline, the intelligence of it all to help us influence what we should do in the future. And when we look at the leadership teams that we have, in general, we have a similarity bias, and that similarity bias is that our senior leadership team tables across the FTSE, across S&P 500, they are very similar, and therefore it lacks in diversity. Even though from a gender perspective, we've made some great strides across the UK and the US, we're still lacking in terms of the other different demographics that aren't being addressed there. So if you are a leader working in an environment where we have these 5 megatrends, 4 of them are probably much more apparent to you that you will see on a day-to-day basis, how do you ensure that you're tapping into all of these changes in the best way possible?
And how do you think reverse mentoring helps with that? Is it simply the perspective of people that are coming up and are perhaps much more aware of these giant shifts?
Absolutely. But I also think the breadth of experience that you have, so not just from an age perspective, which is the biggest thing that we have currently at the moment, but when you look at the 5 different generations in the workforce, for example, the policies that you will have and you will put in place, you have to think of that from a more holistic point of view now, because you don't have such a massive chunk in a certain age bracket. It's actually spreading out quite a little bit more now. And ultimately, people's life choices and decisions are different. And so it's really trying to understand what you can do to listen more so that you can adjust, for example, your policies to address that. But I think also, most importantly, where we have different people internally to the organizations, our consumers are also a lot more conscious at the moment. And when we look at that element around climate change and resource scarcity, people, and all the polls really allude to the fact that people making decisions on where they purchase and who they purchase from with that climate change and kind of that ethical lens in mind as well. So when we look at the Edelman Trust reports, we can actually see that the general population trust organizations now more than they did before, more than governments even. And the CEOs, there's a great responsibility on CEOs to manage their organizations, not just from a profit perspective, but from an impact perspective too. So I think as a CEO, if you're thinking, okay, right, we've got all these changes that are coming down the line, how do I make sure that I have a plan which not only from a macro level makes sense, but how do I keep kind of that human interaction and human touch with the individuals that are in my organization? And from an age perspective, definitely. But when you look at the different demographics, it's definitely something that I've seen. I was at dinner last night with one of the organizations that I helped set up a program for. And the leaders were really just expressing the fact that they would have never been able to previously have kind of such a deep and meaningful informal relationship with someone of difference, because all of the information that flows up to them is in a very hierarchical, formal way. So just, can we grab a coffee, and, what's going on in life from a perspective that you've built that relationship before. They didn't kind of have that. So now they feel really comfortable in, if they've got a policy change or if they've got something coming up and they want to have an alternative point of view, without the formalities, they can kind of tap into that relationship and ask those questions. And, I was also reflecting on the fact that, before, historically, we used to have like one leadership style that leaders would have, and everyone would just fall in line and follow that leadership style. And now leaders are really being pulled on to kind of tap into different sides of them to make sure they're leading people in the way that they would like to be leaded. And that is a real challenge for some of our leaders. So really tapping into reverse mentoring as a tool to understand actually how does that group in general, using very general terms, like to be managed, and what is it that they need more of me for, and what parts of me can I dial up or dial down in order to lead them in the best way.
And to come back to something you mentioned earlier about listening, is learning to listen more actively do people get training to do this? Because I imagine that's really not something that some leaders are very good at.
Two ears and one mouth for a reason, they say. And the leaders have all the feedback from the leaders are definitely the fact that they really struggle with this part. So as we get them on the program, part of their training is to really sit down and figure out actually where are some of their gaps, and how do you listen more? How do you ask questions where you're not expected to know the answer, but you really want to lean into the discussion and the conversation around understanding someone of difference, or just understanding someone that you would not normally interact with. So the listening part is really one of the challenges. And I call it like leaders need to assume the position of the novice. And that means that when you're in office, you ask more questions and you listen more. And it's kind of getting into that frame of mind and recognizing and taking the pressure off them almost, because they don't have to have all the answers in this situation. They are the learner and they just need to listen.
So to take that more widely, how do you set up a reverse mentoring program? Is there kind of an induction? Is there a best practice for it?
I've written a book actually on it, And so, yes, there is best practice. Ultimately, the process that I go through is a lot of work with the program leader and the leadership team to understand why do you think reverse mentoring is a tool for you? So I often start by doing a lot of a deep dive to understand where some of the challenges that they are in the business, and why they think reverse mentoring is the intervention that's going to help them fix that. I would say 50% of the time reverse mentoring is not the tool for them to use, because it's new and it's shiny and it's interesting and people are talking about it and there's a buzz. But for me, I strip it back and take it back a few levels, because one, you need an organization where there is a good level of employee engagement in order for it to sit and embed really well. And what I mean by that is, if there is low trust within the organization, a reverse mentoring program is not going to fix that. It will probably make it a little bit worse. And that leads into psychological safety. So is there a strong and a high level of psychological safety within the organization, not only from an inclusion, a learner or contributor perspective, but is there appetite and room for challenge? Because ultimately, in these relationships, I don't just want the leaders to listen, although I did just say that. I want them to have a propensity to act on what they have learned. Because ultimately, if an underrepresented person is sharing their lived experience, maybe reliving some trauma to explain the depth of what they've been through, that can't just fall on ears which are just listening. There needs to be a commitment to act to drive change. And so that's some of the questions that I ask and challenges that I push to say, right, okay, if we set up a program, what is the propensity to act? Like, you have the power and you hold the power, leaders. What are you prepared to do with that power? So really just understanding some of the foundations in terms of where are we in terms of psychological safety, where there is power, how likely are you to act on that power, but also setting up a whole process in terms of this is the training that you need to go on to make sure that you're understanding why you're in this role, why you're in this position, what the underlying inclusion strategy is as to why we think we should use this intervention, because a lot of it is around conversation, a lot of it is around communication. So people will be asking, like, what is this reverse mentoring program and why are we doing it? Everybody needs to be clear as to why they're doing it, not just this is something that the team have come up with and this is why we're doing it. Those ones will ultimately fail because there's no point of accountability there. Check-ins with both the mentors and the mentees as we go through the program to make sure that we're staying on track to achieve what we want to out of the program. Course correcting where we need to. So I have a great template, obviously, but I work with the organisations to make sure it's bespoke to them, because ultimately the language that I speak and the language that they speak might be different, and we want to make sure that the messages resonate well with the people that are involved in the program. And so it takes a business lead as well as me to come in to kind of work together to make sure the program is going to resonate and hit the employees in the way that we want it to. And then finally, it's wrapping up at the end to say, you know, what is it that we have gained from this experience? What do we want to do differently next time? And then roll it out to different departments at scale, or we keep it within kind of the C-suite. The reason I think it works exceptionally well as an intervention is because it's the only one that senior leaders cannot delegate responsibility for. So they can be, you know, you could be the sponsor for an ERG, an employee resource group, for example, and that means that you'll come in every now and then to kind of review the plans and approve the plans. But with reverse mentoring, you have to put yourself in a deeply vulnerable position. You have to be courageous. You need to adopt that growth mindset that everyone talks about. And I always liken it to the fact that you can adopt the growth mindset for sales and for operations, but when it comes to the people side, that's the hard part, right? Changing people's mindsets and attitudes is really tough and difficult. But once the leaders have been part of it, they acknowledge how challenging it can be. And so when they're talking, they can talk with real credibility because they've been through that process as well. And so that's why I think it's one of the kind of the best interventions to really drive change within the leadership team.
Thanks, Patrice. I'm just going to remind the audience that you can send questions in at any time. We've got a couple in, but okay. I'm going to hold those for a minute because I wanted to just talk about timescales. Mm-hmm. Is there a timescale? All of this sounds like it. I mean, do you set different timescales for? Does it depend on the organisation?
It does. I have done programs between 3 months to 12 months, and they are the 3 months to 6 months are pilots, and then the 12 months are a full year program. And so they will move through some of the challenges with the organisation at that point. So it'll be the first few sessions, really getting to know the individuals, then tapping into maybe some of the live meaty topics that you have in the organisation at the time. And some of the longer programs are the ones that are really inextricably linked with the employee engagement plan. So you're looking at, you know, some of those questions that we get asked. So, you know, how do you communicate with your leader? Do you feel like your leader knows and understands and values you? Do you think the leader in the organisation makes decisions with your best interests at heart? So these are some of the questions in the employee engagement survey that really attune to like the employee engagement and the leadership angle. And so where we have really comprehensive plans, the reverse mentoring and the employee engagement plan are really tightly linked. Where there are smaller pilots, then it's a pilot which is looking at a specific team or a specific area that we're trying to dig into. But it will depend on the organisation appetite, and it will look at the overall engagement strategy as well.
Is there any, you know, written feedback, or, you know, how do the leaders have to write something?
Yep.
You know, how do we know what's happened? I mean, I presume some of it is confidential.
It is, but there is for my clients, we have 2 workbooks, a mentor and a mentee workbook, where we come together at the start to talk about the objectives that they share between them. I see those, not everyone sees those. So I can kind of look at it from an overall organizational perspective. And then in the check-ins that we do in between, within the cohorts, it's a real sharing exercise. So within that safe space, within those 2 cohorts of the mentors and the mentees, we ask them to share their feelings and their feedback in terms of what they can do differently. And at the end point, we pull together a report which goes through, actually, these are the learnings that we've had. These are the things that we're going to take forward. These are the things that we want to change for the next round. And that's particularly important, because otherwise you're just having a real good talking shop with no concrete actions afterwards. So there is a report for each of the clients at the end of it to talk about the change. And then when that's nicely linked to the employee engagement plan, we then tap and track some of the key questions from a leadership perspective to the reverse mentoring element. And I think we also talked about it earlier today, where it's not just the individual relationship, it's trickle down throughout the whole organization. So where you will have this relationship maybe with one individual, that person who is part of another group, which has great intersectionality, they will either have a great experience, a not so great experience, or a terrible experience, and that will reverberate throughout the whole organization. So when you're looking at those leadership behaviors, it's, through the experience of 1 or 2 individuals that have impact with the rest of the organization. So it's always really important to remember that. But yeah, we'll pull together quite a comprehensive report at the end with the learnings and with the next steps.
So that reflects one of the questions we've got here, which is, how do you measure success on reverse mentoring? Would it be in that report, and what changes?
Yes, definitely. I'm working alongside some of the mentoring platform providers at the moment as well. And we have seen across literally all of them almost a 200% increase in the request for reverse mentoring programs over the past couple of years. They are great in terms of the evidence that you can collate from them, but also the fact that, that 92% of like the S&P have mentoring programs at the moment, and you can track that to the performance. You can also break that down into different levels to really understand the employee engagement numbers and the attrition alongside the retention of individuals who have been involved in reverse mentoring programs. And what's really great to see is with a lot of that evidence, that not only is the retention for the mentors, who are the underrepresented individuals, but with the mentees, their retention is also higher. And the reports have shown that they have a real sense of purpose after being involved in these programs. So not only do the underrepresented individuals feel seen, heard, and valued, but the leaders also feel like they're giving something back from a more human perspective as well. And that's really wonderful to see.
Great. So we've also got, what are some of the first steps to implement this in the organisation? Do people volunteer, or are they picked on both sides? And also, this is from me, do you find resistance in terms of the senior leadership? Do they step forward, or do they have to be persuaded? How does it go?
Let's start with that question. So, I would say the tone is set from the top. So I've worked with some great organisations where the CEO or the C-suite are like, right, we're definitely doing this. I'm signing up. And, that leadership saying that I'm signing up generally gets other people to sign up too. Where it is a little bit more, I think you should do this, really important, I would say that I have to do a lot of work to make sure that they are aware of the responsibility that they're carrying to enter into that relationship. Because when you force participation from both a mentor and a mentee perspective, and when I say force, I think you should really do this and get involved in it. You want the right appetite there, especially if you're doing a pilot. You need that right level of appetite to be able to drive proper constructive change. And that's not to say that those individuals on that kind of scale of maybe not interested can't be convinced, but you want to start on, like, I want to say, fertile ground where people can lean into the experience and really get the most from it. And I always find that those are the individuals that may be on the fence, and those individuals that are the key advocates. They will really put their whole selves into that first experience. And then that gives a really good kind of case study for others to get involved into later. So in the first instance with your question, in terms of how do people get selected from it, it's a whole application process in terms of being really clear. This is what the program is. This is what we're trying to get out of it. If you're an individual who wants to be a mentor, these are the key skills that we're looking for, but tell us what you can bring and what you want to share. And then from a mentee perspective, I ask questions alongside of, how have you contributed towards making your organisation an inclusive place to work thus far, and really tapping into some of the kind of underlying motivations that people might have, so that we pull those together and then we do a matching exercise to ensure that there's a good amount of stretch in terms of someone who's different, but also a acknowledgement that someone might want to tap into a relationship that they might not have the privilege of being able to do on a day-to-day basis.
And just picking up on that a little bit, is there a, not to bring it down, but what are the potential disadvantages? What do you have to look for?
I think, one of my biggest challenge with all of my clients is time. And now I've kind of developed a good understanding in terms of if we're really slow to start, or if meetings keep on getting shifted and half the team aren't there when we do it and I have to repeat it for the other half of the team, that's not a real fertile ground for me to start the program on. And ultimately, as we move through the program, I end up and the team end up catching parts as opposed to bringing it together for a cohesive conversation. So I would say time is one of the biggest challenges. And then where organisations aren't 100% clear as to why they want reverse mentoring as an intervention, that's where it can get a bit messy, and we have to spend a bit more time in trying to tee it up, because I think that's the biggest challenge. Then where relationships don't go so right, and leaders kind of step away from it due to the discomfort as opposed to leaning into it, that doesn't bode well, because ultimately that encourages kind of more distrust and mistrust within the organisation, because people have volunteered their time, they've leaned into the opportunity, and then things haven't quite gone right, and then you haven't quite resolved it, and then that's a really negative experience for the individual, which then trickles down to the rest of the organisation. And if not addressed properly, then it's kind of like, well, that didn't work, we're not going to try that again.
So you have to be quite careful not to sort of create ripples of...
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So what type of organisation could benefit the most? Would it be as effective in a big organisation or a small one? Or is it a universal?
I would say it's universal. Where I've worked on it with larger organisations, I like to pick a department, or the department picks me usually, to say, actually, can we trial it here? And then they understand how it will work within the organisational construct, and then we can expand it wider into different parts of the organisation. I'd say with smaller organisations, we have to just be very conscious, because a key tenet to this is psychological safety. And when we do the pairings, we try to not pair them with individuals that are in the same department, because that encourages more of a free conversation, because you don't necessarily want to be having a conversation with your boss's boss's boss, because that could have other implications for you in the workplace. So it's just really trying to find that balance. For smaller organisations, what I recommend is more kind of listening circles, and really trying to use the principles of reverse mentoring, which is listening, understanding, and then having an action-orientated plan, bringing those principles in to do more guided conversations with a wider group of people. So it feels less intensive for the leader, and it feels less intensive for the individual. If you're in like a 20-person or a really small organisation, then you won't necessarily trip up on each other, because you're having a wider conversation. So it's usually much more beneficial in that way.
And what would the role of HR be in terms of implementing reverse mentoring? Do you work closely with HR partners?
Yeah, I do. And when I first started, it was like, right, HR, this and this. But then when I started to do more research and work with more organisations, those larger organisations, HR only really get involved when they're hiring or when there is a problem. So it's like in or out, alongside some of the kind of middle pieces around compliance, for example. So in those organisations, actually, I have a program lead who is someone who is responsible for kind of the people aspect of the department, who are not HR, but they take this responsibility on, usually on the side of their desk, in terms of a employee engagement piece that they will have. So with those organisations, it's much better to work with those leads. And then in some organisations, HR are slick, and they have all of the policies that they manage, and they want to be the funnel through which things go through. So it just depends on the organisation. But I would say it's 50-50. 50% of the time it's HR that bring me in, and 50% of the time it's a program lead or an ERG lead who have heard about reverse mentoring, tried it before, and want some help in kind of adding some rigour to it to make sure it sticks within the organisation.
Which external organisations offer reverse mentorship options for cross-sector learning? Have you ever been involved in that?
I haven't been involved in that, but I do know, well, actually, there's a few organisations in hospitality, so Women in Hospitality, Travel and Leisure, also Women in Travel CRC. Obviously, my background is in travel. So I've been involved in those programmes myself, but it's very impactful, especially, again, for some of those smaller organisations who might not have the breadth within the organisation to test it with. To be involved in something external is definitely helpful.
Patrice, we're running very short for time. Is there one thing you'd like to leave the audience with?
I would like to say that, ultimately, we all live in a world which is getting much more polarized than ever. And the only way that we are going to get through this is together, but to lean into our human side and really lean into not what kind of the rhetoric is saying in terms of like amplifying those differences, but really leaning into the fact that we are all human. And just to have a conversation with someone of difference, I assure you will find much more that you have in common than you would have in difference. So lean into those differences and find the commonalities, because I think the world just definitely needs to be much more connected.
Patrice Gordon, thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well.